afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Designing Research with Intention, Culturally Responsive, Trauma-Informed, and Humanizing Strategies to Engage Youth. So some of our key takeaways that we plan on speaking on today that we hope you take away from today's webinar is really some tips and strategies about how to humanize yourself when conducting research with youth, some strategies about meeting youth where they are as you conduct this research with them, and how spaces and places matter in this research process. And then we like to end with what we call the 3 C's: confidentiality, compliance, and consent. So some critical aspects of conducting research and evaluation with youth. So our agenda for today is we'll do a brief overview of our work and a research project that we undertook. Some tips and strategies about humanizing yourself within this space, how to meet young people where they are, how spaces and places matter, then some tips on planning and logistics that may be at the forefront of your mind throughout this process. And then again, as I mentioned, we're going to wrap up with the 3 C's, talking about confidentiality, comfortability, and consent, and why those things are important when doing this type of work with youth. We will end and have time for questions. So if you do have questions, we will have time for you all to present those questions with us. You can also use the chat box throughout this presentation if you have questions, and we'll try to answer those questions throughout the webinar, and then also again at the end of the webinar. So right here, I did want to highlight our team here at Community Science. And so our work focuses on equity and community engagement research and evaluation. And so just here on the screen, you can see a quick glance of our entire team here at Community Science and BCT Partners. So today's webinar will feature our Youth Leadership Practice Area team. And so on today's webinar, we have Brandy Gilbert, who I will let everyone quickly introduce themselves before we get started.
Hey everyone, we're excited to see you today and to be talking with you. I'm Brandy Gilbert. I'm one of the leads for the Youth Engagement Practice Area at Community Science, and excited to be with you. I'll pass it to Danielle.
Hello, Danielle Gilmore. I am also a part of the Youth Leadership Engagement Practice Area. I do a lot of work around the qualitative research and evaluation. Devontae, we already heard from him, so I guess I'll hop over to Dante.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dante, and I'm also a part of the youth development team, and I assist Danielle with the qualitative analysis, and I'm glad to be here with you all today.
Perfect. Thank you. And we're going to pass things over to Brandy, who is going to kick us off for today's webinar.
Hey, thanks. Next slide, please. Hey again, everyone. Thank you for joining. We saw from your registration that many of you yourselves are leading work that involves young people, centering the stories of young people and their experiences through research and evaluation. So again, we're super excited to see you and to share some of our work today. So one of the research studies we'll be talking about is our recent project that we're actually in the throes of right now. We're in the process of collecting data. We've interviewed about 60 young people so far, who are ages 14 to 26. They're based in different cities in Connecticut, and they are currently not connected to school or work or other social supports. And our study really focuses about how young people survive and how they thrive, and also how they may get reconnected when they're not connected to things like school, work, and social supports. And at the bottom, we have some key research questions. And again, this study is just a little bit about what we're up to, particularly focused on adolescents and young adults. That's what we mean when we say youth or young people. And it's a study that we've had to be very thoughtful about and engaging this population and being respectful and thoughtful and meaningful and useful as we approach this work for our partners and for the young people that we're working with. So next slide. we're going to be talking again about these strategies that we shared on the front end. The first one that Danielle will share is about humanizing ourselves. And just one note before we get started, again, that we are a full research team at Community Science, and the practices that we're sharing are going to be reflecting things that we have done specifically to be responsive to young people in this project. And it's also helped to, all of us have past work with young people, both research and evaluation. So we bought those past experiences to continue to hone, just like you are likely, how we approach youth-focused research and evaluation. Danielle?
Thanks, Brandy. So to Brandy's point, we will be talking a little bit about how we can engage some youth. And it's really important when we're doing this work to also recognize our own biases, cultural preferences, and even strengths and assets that we also might have always bring to the work. And so when we're doing some of this, we also need to be intentional about the ways in which we show up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's two key components of doing work and you're engaging with young people. The first to think about is how to build authentic connections with these young people. A lot of times if you're doing research, interviews, things like that, it is a short amount of time that you do have to build rapport with participants. And so it is very important to spend time being intentional. And so some of the ways in which we worked on humanizing ourselves, which allow us to be intentional about how we show up, allows us to be a lot more relatable to participants. And so some of the things that we consider are our dress code. What are we wearing, shoes, the type of sneakers, the brand we might have, right? If we're going into a population that's low income, maybe not wearing, keeping those Gucci sneakers at home, those type of things. There's very subtle things that help to build connection when we show up. Also thinking about the ways in which we build rapport with young people and the initial engagements that we have with them. That can look at things like, talking about some of the things that we're familiar with as well. So as a part of this engagement, it's key when you're building authenticity and you're working on trying to create a space for people to feel vulnerable, that you also mirror the openness and the vulnerability in which you are asking from young people. And so some of the ways in which you can also build authentic connection while thinking about ways to, make us not seem like those big, scary researchers, but humans just like you, are things like those reciprocal disclosures, how we greet participants and things like that, and being mindful about what we share. Another component of this is also recognizing we are humans as well. We bring our whole selves to the work, especially for doing it right. And so that can allow us to kind of venture into some emotional dynamics that can be, quite challenging to navigate, especially if you're dealing with a topic that is very sensitive. For example, you're talking about trauma, or a very, painful memory or a heavy charged emotion or a topic. And so it's also important kind of as you are a researcher and you want to be present or even doing evaluation to be as neutral as possible, to not, compromise the integrity of the data, because participants, they might start to show up and act differently if they know that maybe something that you are saying might offend that, they're worried that they might offend you, or they might be worried that if something that they say might feel like they're being judged, or maybe something that they're sharing is upsetting you visibly. It also begins to affect your data integrity because it then starts to affect the ways in which participants might be gathering some of that data. So specifically when we're thinking about building authentic connections, really the ways in which you show up and how you're present matter. Even in situations where it is a casual or it's quote unquote more low stakes, you do have to recognize that as a researcher or someone who's doing evaluation, there is often a perceived power dynamic between the participants and the person who is doing some of the data collection. And so that's why it's really important to kind of think about even that initial impression of how you're greeting them and the ways in which you can share about yourself. And as you're navigating some of these emotional dynamics, keeping in mind ways it can be things for your team that are self-soothing or grounding activities. And so really thinking about how this shows up in your work and the ways in which you can incorporate techniques that allow your team to participate in some of these activities. So for us, breathing techniques is a big part of what we do because it's something that's very subtle that you can do while you're triggered or if you're experiencing an intense emotion. And a lot of times it's not something, that might necessarily let on. And so also thinking about that post-care interview work as well when you are navigating difficult conversations. And so these are some of the ways in which you start to think about how we can humanize your team. Brandy will talk a little bit more about how this can show up for youth and young people.
Thanks, Danielle. And something that I should have added on the front end, Danielle, is a little bit more about why you might be talking about these strategies is that this study, as well as other studies that we've worked on, focus on different levels of systems engagement. So in this case, we're talking to young people who may have had past experience with the criminal justice system or juvenile justice system, foster care, health system in different ways in terms of physical and mental health, as well as, I'm leaving one out, foster care, criminal justice, I'm leaving
Education.
Thank you. And education systems, including those, because this study focused on young people who are no longer in school. So many of them have left school before finishing their high school graduation, or might have a range of different experiences with school. We've also done past work, I know myself, with young people who have experienced disasters and they're in disaster recovery phase, young people who are experiencing actively food insecurity. So I think to point to the reason, Danielle, while you're sharing some of these strategies is because many of the experiences that the young people are willing to share with us to help to learn and build research and evidence, inform programs, practices, policies, and things does have a very sensitive nature. So you talked a little bit about what it looks like from the researcher's perspective. And next, I'm going to share a little bit about what our team has done to think about how we make that a good experience, not only for ourselves and thinking about how we handle our team and us as researchers and evaluators, but also how we handle kind of the look, the feel, the experience for young people that we might have, especially like you said, Danielle, that we have a very short time to build rapport in some of these cases because we don't have a longer term relationship with all of the young people who we've been in with different studies. Next slide, please. So some of this is thinking about so in this case, we're using qualitative data and having an interview process one-on-one, or sometimes a team of two talking to one or two young people. This has looked like for us an interview where it's conversational. We're really focusing on being present. So for us, that means a total lockdown, of being in that space. We're not checking our cell phones. We don't have our computers up. We don't have our email, no outside sort of distractions. We also have made an active choice on our team to not take notes while people are talking. And I know in other studies that we lead, we're typing away, especially when we're talking to maybe people who are leads of organizations or different types of things where they're so used to people typing as they talk, it's nothing. But for young people, we made an active choice not to be typing during their discussion because we don't want that to feel like two things. One, we don't want it to feel like any past engagement with systems like maybe criminal justice system, sort of people getting information, taking information, talking about things that are challenging. And two, we want to be careful about kind of the power dynamics and just instead having open conversation. Again, where we're active listener, and similar to Danielle, what you were sharing, it's like we're being mindful of our body language. We're thinking about what people share with us, and we're showing empathy, but we're not sort of showing shock or shutting down and things. And people have told us very sensitive things. I mean, from things around child abuse, engagement in crime, and any kind of scary, crazy, sad thing that you might think could come up has many times come up in our past work, but still, again, showing empathy for those situations and not having that kind of sort of shock value. We also do this in how we think about just even building an interview guide from the beginning. So first starting with an interview script. And that script has on the front end rapport builders. And even this team has had discussions about when do you use rapport builders. So for us in this study, the rapport builders we use are things like what's your favorite food or your favorite place to eat close by, since we're talking about local communities, or what do you love most about living here? And then some of our team has said, like, I don't use those rapport builders. I don't really like them. I just like to have like natural conversation. Sometimes that's even already flowing before the audio recorder is on. So we have kind of preferences there, but we all agree that rapport building has to happen in the beginning. The second thing is like for this study in particular, there's a lot of questions about relationships. So asking young people to talk about who's around them in their community, and in their family and their household. What does their relationships look like? And we tend to both relationships that are positive and supportive, as well as relationships that might be riskier and not so helpful for a young person. Then we sort of transition. So again, like whatever your topic might be, this is like a build up for us. So in particular, because we know that systems like talking about foster care, juvenile justice, health, those things could be challenging for some people. It's further along in the interview guide. So then we ask those questions. And then on the back end, when we're getting further along in our interview, then we're getting to things about goals and aspirations of young people. And again, that is purposeful because we're ending and throughout, we're approaching through asset and strength-based framing, even when we're talking about challenging topics. So we want to be ending on that positive note and asking young people, what are their goals? Where do they see themselves? Where are they headed and what supports do they need to be getting there? And here we also talk a little bit about how we meet people where they are. So some of that is we tend to things around our participants. So really being responsive to like, what does a young person who's 14 to 26 in our case, what do they need to show up? And I ask you to think about that, for the work that you do too. What do young people need to show up? And sometimes we know what all those things are when we go into a study, and sometimes we don't. But then when we see them, we're responsive to them. So for instance, we have transportation. Sometimes we are helping people get an Uber or Lyft to us. Sometimes the partners that we work with are helping young people to transport them, but we know that that's an important thing. Also, when we first started the interviews, they were mostly during the day. And then we moved to more evening, and our team also has openness to weekend interviews, although for this most recent project, we haven't started that. Another thing, Daniel, you talked a little bit about emotional support, but another thing is we always have a lot of food with us. And sometimes people only eat a little, and sometimes they eat all of it. 2 people eat all of it, sometimes even. But we always want to be prepared, even if it means another person might run out and get some more things. We want to make sure nobody's hungry or thirsty when they're talking to us. Or if they don't feel comfortable eating or breaking bread with us, they take something on the way out the door after talking for an hour. So that's really important. And then next, gender selection. So because some of our questions around relationships also talk about violence, including sexual violence, finding that some of the young women we talk to don't feel as comfortable when they're talking to a male team member of ours. So having gender pairing options where we always have both male and female interviewers on our team who are available. And at the bottom, here are some strategies that we've also used for adapting our interview guide based on developmental stage. For us, we have a wide age range that's within our study, and we understand that some people who are on the younger spectrum of that age range might need a little bit more scaffolding, and their stories might go in lots of different places, and that's okay. So we're sort of rolling with them. Also, we recognize that young people, sometimes their schedules are complex. So that means they might show up and suddenly a friend calls them or a family member calls them and they need to leave or they need to answer a call. And that's totally okay. We say, do whatever you need. Come back, stay, take a break. And sometimes people they seem surprised that we are that responsive to them, but we consider that an expectation to be in that space and to do that work, that we have to be responsive and we can't be as rigid as if maybe we were interviewing, let's say, social workers during their job at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, that they would be there, it would start on time, it would last an hour. All those kinds of things are a little bit different when we're working with younger population, especially one that has lots of complexities for some young people. And I see we have lots of questions in the chat too. Maybe some of them are related to some recent things around recruitment and research, maximizing, not taking notes during interviews. So we're also going to be responsive to these questions too. We'll take a beat in a second and start to respond to them. So another thing is managing triggers. So Danielle, you talked a little bit about how we as researchers and evaluators might manage those triggers for ourselves. It's also about helping young people to manage triggers. So sometimes if a young person might be sharing something that's difficult for them to talk about, we might you help them use self-soothing techniques. So reminding them like it's okay to take a deep breath. Or we might pause ourselves, which creates a pause in the interview, and just kind of breathe with them. Again, show empathy, allow for breaks, have tissues. Now we have a bag of supplies, or we always have tissues. I don't know why on our first trip we didn't, but we do now. In every bag, research bag, we have tissues with our snacks and our drinks and everything. And again, we remind people that they can stop at any time, and we also have virtual options, especially for those people who are 18 and over, to loop back in and talk to us later if they need a little break. So lastly, I'm going to share about meeting people where they are in terms of one experience that we've had in our recent study is having young people who have children who are with them during the time of the research. And so in some cases, the partners that we've worked with have been able to provide childcare and already have that setting in place, and children are in those settings. But in other cases, young people come to participate in the study and they might have a young child with them. So in the beginning, we didn't have processes for this, and we didn't expect as many children to be around as there were. And then our team developed, again, this is just about being responsive, developed these protocols for what do we do if there are children in the room. And this came from things that we found ourselves doing in the moment. But one thing that we also encourage you all to do is if you find yourself doing something in the moment, it keeps coming up, to make this a process. So after a couple of us were having young children, our interviews, we came back together and said, hey, I'm seeing this. This is what I did. What did you do? So together we came up with these terms that now, not only do we have tissues, we have toys. We have toys, we have coloring sheets, we print them again. Danielle, she usually prints them before each research trip. I buy Play-Doh before each research trip. We now also have fidget spinners, which can be for kids or also adults wanting something to fidget with too. And we're flexible. So that means if children are in the room, we don't ask questions about sexual trauma and things like that that we would in our other interviews. Or we might ask them, sometimes the children are in and out of the room space. We might ask them when the children are not in the room, but then we wouldn't continue that discussion if they came in. And then we're also super flexible. So this means that I know I personally have been in interviews and times where I'm like holding a baby on the side while a mother can be more focused on talking to me. So I'm double tasking, but she's not. Or I'm grabbing a bottle of water so a mother can make formula. People are changing diapers on the side. I mean, there are lots of things going on, and we're just being responsive to it, whether that means breaks or other supplies or whatever that might be.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandy. So next we want to kind of talk about designing your research intention with the understanding that spaces and places matter where you conduct this research. So the environment and climate in which your interviews take place matters, and it matters a lot. And that's for safety reasons, for comfortability for yourself, for the participants who are going to be engaged in that research, and just for logistics and logistical reasons. And so in instances where you are collecting data regarding sensitive topics, such as those that Brandy has shared that we're covering in this particular study, that are related to health issues, social challenges, or the youth interactions with different systems, meeting these young people in familiar places and settings that they are used to can allow for them to discuss these issues more openly and honestly and freely and feel comfortable in doing that. And so we encourage you all to kind of be mindful at all times of the spaces and places that you are planning to conduct your interviews in, really to help minimize the potential of adding additional stressors or pressure or psychological distress to your participants, and really reduce that chance of potentially placing the youth in an unsafe or unhealthy place or environment, and ultimately compromising their own privacy, safety, and the sensitivity of that conversation. And so when we say space matters, that is physically, that's mentally, and that's emotionally. So really trying to be mindful of it from all those different lenses and aspects. And so really when we're thinking about that physical space, ensuring that you have selected and chosen a space that is safe and welcoming physically, um, for the youth's well-being, during that entire interview process, and reducing those instances where you can cause those additional traumas. And I'll give examples of each of these after we go through it too. And then when we're thinking about this mental, we're thinking about making sure that that space that you are in is comfortable for the youth. There's no life-threatening circumstances or safety concerns that put the youth at risk for being in that place. And when we talk about places and spaces, it's not just the actual physical brick and mortar, but thinking about taking in context the neighborhood. So thinking about the youth that we're working with, some of them are affiliated with different gangs or from certain sides of the city. And so being mindful that it may not be safe for a youth from one part of the city to come to another side of the city to engage in these interviews and conversations. So being mindful of that to reduce those added pressures and stressors, and anxiety that may come with asking someone to come to a different part of the city that they're not familiar with, or that they have had prior um, occurrences of issues or trauma in. Then also focusing on that emotional piece when you're working with the youth. And so when we're talking about the emotional piece, it's really creating an environment that is emotionally open and emotionally accepting of the youth. And so providing them in a space that is safe for them emotionally to share their feelings, especially given the topics and conversations that we will be talking about in those spaces. So some of those examples, when we're thinking about that physical place, again, is the locations and the organizations that you're working with in your youth that you're using to either help recruit or host you for those interviews. And some of the places that we found to be the most safe and opening for those youth have been places such as community centers, nonprofits in the local community, the schools, the libraries, and other youth serving organizations have been places that youth typically are comfortable with and comfortable being in. When we're focusing on that mental piece, really thinking about the inclusion of mentally relaxing activities and objects on site during the interview. And so Brandy and Danielle kind of touched on this a little bit, and you'll probably keep hearing this a lot because we learned throughout this process that this was really important, and the youth really enjoyed it. So using things such as fidget spinners, the stress balls, having the coloring book materials, we found youth of all ages actually have used these materials and really taken likeness to these materials, and so really using them within your study.
And they took them home. They
And
liked
they
them
take
so
them
much.
home. Yes. That was one that we was not expecting too, that we're constantly restocking that because they do take them home. At the end of multiple of my interviews, they were asked like, can I take this home with me? And so we allow them to take them with them. And then on the emotional side, the process of directly connecting participants to social services resources shall they request it. So there has been instances where after going through our interview guide with the youth, a lot of youth had tell us like, this made me think about things in a way that I've never thought about, or it was helpful to actually just talk about this and talk through this because I never really fully talked through this, or I've never shared this with anyone else. And they've reached a point where now they want to get connected with social services. And so instead of just leaving them and saying, hey, we can give you a contact, or we can give you a card, we can give you a website, we directly connect them right then and there at the end of the interview with social services supports. So every location that we do our interviews in, we have someone on site from a local nonprofit that we can connect them with, whether that be a social worker or a case manager who is able to then get them connected to resources in their local community, because we don't want to place that burden back on them to be the ones to have to reach out to do those connections. So we like to do that directly, hands-on right then and there.
Thank you. So now I'm going to be talking about the design and research with intention around planning and logistics. So basically, when designing with intention around logistics, it involves very careful planning to ensure that the study runs smoothly and ethically. This basically encompasses like just making sure that you have the appropriate tools, the appropriate methods, and then also considering like specific needs of the research population. A little bit of the things that Devontae provided just a little bit more information on. Basically, around this is what's about like paying attention to details, using user-friendly platforms, and streamlining communication that all creates like an inclusive and respectable research environment. And then when we think about like these logistical like considerations, this also extends like the ethical handling of like the sensitive information. And then like Devontae said, like also looking at the providing support to these participants, such as, you know, trauma informed strategies, and like also having like these incentives, and then also connecting them with these caseworkers or these nonprofits, just to make sure that we enhance the overall experiences of the participants. And then when thinking about the thoughtful, trying to be thoughtful around like the logistics, this also helps us as researchers execute like the stuff that we're trying to find, this study effectively, but also prioritizing the well-being of the people, and then also enhancing that engagement. So here we have like these 4 little buckets around like the local and organizational support, technological support, then thinking about the best practices for interviewing, and then like note-taking guidance. Devontae talked a little bit about like that the agency or the organizational support. So basically what we considered, or what we've done, was we have these meetings beforehand with these agencies, these nonprofits, or these partners, to ask them about like their space, you know, talk about some safety protocols, because we want to ensure that we're stepping into a place where we can be comfortable, as well as we want the people that are the participants that are doing these interviews to be comfortable as well. So we want to ensure that we do that, I guess, like 24 to 48 hours beforehand, just so we can have some prep time, and then they can have some prep time as well. Then thinking about, you know, also respecting like their norms and their, and then like how Danielle said, like talking about like the dress codes. But we just, again, it's all about safety when thinking about like the support that we're looking for from these agencies. Then looking at the technological support, this is basically when we think about like the consent forms. Like say we do have like physical consent forms, but say we have a participant that their parent, like they're I guess like minors, so we have people that are under the age of 18. We also have these consent forms that can be sent virtually through DocuSign. So we make sure that we have this platform already set up, and it's easily accessible through email, and it's also accessible through text message. But we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to be able to share their voice, to share their experiences. So we want to ensure that their parents can have this consent, just to make sure that everything is ethically approved. And then thinking about like the virtual Zooms, we do offer that as well. So we make sure that the platform is ready, up and ready to go. We also have a CAG phone, or not a CAG phone, sorry. We also have a study phone, which is basically on a different provider, but we provide this phone for if they need any resources, if they want to set up any interviews. And then we can also connect them to these agencies or these nonprofits to ensure that they get the support that they need. We also give, talking about like incentives, we also do virtual gift cards if they do something virtually. And then we also have physical gift cards. So we want to ensure that the people are getting compensated for their time, and thinking about that. And then when thinking about like the best practices around interviewing, things that we considered was when we do these interviews, we're most likely we're doing audio recordings. So basically we don't do the visuals, but we want to ensure that we get all the information that we can get. So we don't turn off the recordings until the participant leaves the room, because we found that when we're doing like this rapport building, you know, after the interview, the participants, they want to continue talking. And then a lot of the stuff that they say at the end of these interviews are still relevant to the interview. So we want to ensure that we capture everything. Another thing that we considered was also having multiple recorders, having multiple devices to make sure that we have some backups just in case one fails. And then thinking about the recording. So right after the interview is over, we want to ensure that we upload it to a SharePoint or whatever platform that you have to store all the information. And then we also have we upload those recordings to a transcription portal. And then when you think about having like a third-party transcription service, you want to ensure that they also sign a confidentiality agreement, just to ensure that everyone's information is safe. And we also include that within like our rapport building or in the beginning of these interviews, just to ensure that they're comfortable with sharing the information and they won't get out to anyone. And then when thinking about the note-taking guidance, if we're doing like the recording, we want to make sure that we have like these timestamps where we can capture like the key quotes, the examples, the content. And then thinking about like when we're taking these notes, that we stop taking notes when we're talking about like system interactions, but we also provide the option to stop recording if the information or if the topics get too sensitive for the participant, just to continue that comfortability, that to make sure that they're comfortable. And then when we think about like the non-recorded interviews, one of the best things that we to consider is like trying to find that balance between capturing the content and documenting verbatim, and then paraphrasing, and then capturing those keynotes. But just also just ensuring that we get everything, but we don't want to make the participant uncomfortable without the information. So I'll pass it on to Danielle.
And before we move on, thanks so much, Dante. I know we're getting lots of questions in our queue, so Danielle, maybe before we move on to your final section, we can address some of those questions. And one of them, Dante, is related to what you were just sharing about note-taking and transcription. There's a question here that says, what tips you have for recapping and maximizing what you remember when you did not take notes during the interview? So maybe you could share how we approach that.
So one of the things that we've done and that we practice at Community Science as well is like having some mini debriefs after the interviews. So, you know, talking with one of the other people that are doing the interviews and just discussing like what we heard, and then seeing if there's some common themes that we hear across the whole study or all the interviews that we've done in the day. It's like one thing. And then also when we have like our little interview guides, and there's a few things that we can capture. There's like some quick little key like quotes that we remember. But I think the most important thing is just having those little 5 to 10 minute debriefs with your interview partners, just to ensure that we hear the same things and things of that nature. So I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I would also add that just because you're not taking notes during the interview doesn't mean you can't take notes at all. So one thing that I do, if your schedule allows and it's possible and you have enough time between interviews, doing a quick 10, 15-minute debrief memo, brain dump, you know, where you kind of write out or type out some of the things that you stood out to you, quotes, your general impressions, while everything is still fresh. If you're in the field, which we are a lot of times when we're doing these interviews, we actually do verbal or like voice kind of journaling as well, or voice memos, which we can then also have transcribed, or we can review later for notes, which is another way that we also kind of help to hold that information and still capture it while it's fresh, even though we might not have wrote it down during the interview.
I'll also add too that even if your full team may not always be on every data collection trip, that doesn't mean you can't talk to them. So there's been many times after an interview where I'm like, I'll get on the phone, I'll call Brandy, and it's like, let's talk through this. Here are some of the things that I've heard, where Brandy is like, these are some of the things that I heard in my interview. And so there's multiple ways to make sure that you are, one, sharing that knowledge across your team about some of those things that you learned, some of those things that you're hearing, but making sure that we're also documenting it. And each of us actually have kind of our own document where we are constantly updating it since the beginning of the study of like different things that we've heard and seen throughout these interviews too.
Thank you. And then I want to also cover a few more. So there's one that Danielle answered inside the chat about reciprocal disclosure and what ways you sort of share information about yourself that doesn't center you and the team too much. And there's a similar question about, can you talk about how the balance between showing empathy and being neutral? I'll put that out to the team.
Yeah, so I can just, expand a little bit more on in the chat. Some of the things that I said are ways that I like to do this is by looking for commonality. So I kind of like to compare it to that conversation you have in the elevator where, you only got a couple of minutes before your floor. So you're not, opening your life story to this person, but it's still, enough conversation for things to flow. So that could look like, part of the report, one of our rapport builder questions for this particular study was asking people what their favorite restaurant is or a thing that they like to eat in their area. And so it can be, as simple as, oh, I've been to that restaurant too, I really like it. And, you continuously divert back to the participant. And so the ways in which you are weaving in and showing those disclosures help to build connection, but then still continue to bring it back to the participant. Yes, I really like that place. The food is great. Tell me about your favorite time there. Right. And so you use that to pivot into the next probe or into, another leverage point that allows you to build connection. I would say along those same veins, that's kind of very similar to the question around balancing being empathetic while being neutral. So empathy, is the ability to, really put yourself in somebody else's shoes, is perspective taking. And it also is a way that allows people to, to feel comfortable. There's lots of ways you can do this. Some of the things we talked about already, the dressing, mutual sharing, being flexible. But I think the most important thing to remember when you're thinking about empathy versus neutrality is that when you are relating to someone and showing them that you understand what they're going through, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking a position. Right? So for example, a quick, icebreaker could be, something like, they might say something and then you can respond with like, instead of saying something like, I completely agree with you, I don't like that place either, right? You can say that would be, taking a side versus being neutral, where you can say something like, I agree with you, I hear what you're saying, right? And so instead of taking a positionality of like, I agree, I disagree, right? Or using language that has judgment passing in it, whether that is, that doesn't sound right, or maybe that is too much, or that's a lot, right? Once you start to use words that are very descriptive versus questions, a lot of times empathetic statements that might take positions are often statements. But there are ways you can do that, like, that must be really hard for you. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Right? Those are ways to validate someone's experience while showing empathy, and also avoiding aligning your experiences or your emotions or your feelings or offering a solution. And so those are some of the ways in which we try to be mindful. And then, of course, I would say another point in which you see this is when you ask clarifying questions or probing. And so if you are doing this in an empathetic way, somebody might have an unclear response. And so you could say things that really help you to understand where they're coming from. So you lean in with understanding. Can you speak a little bit more? Say more, please. Right? And being neutral while doing that allows you to do that in a way that's non-leading. So not biasing by saying, oh, it sounds like you felt sad. Is that true? Versus, tell me how you feel about that. And so those are some ways in which you can remain empathetic and still be neutral. I'm sure you all have lots of other ways.
And also I wanted to drop in just a few more questions too. There are a few back-to-back questions about the virtual space also. And to share that we have not actually ended up using the virtual space in this study in particular. We have had other studies where we've done interviews with young people virtually. We have designed a full set of processes for virtual interviews. And there were some questions around tips and things. And what we focused on is what you can attain from the virtual space. So still reading of the body language, leaning in and being careful of how we use our own body language, reading social cues from other people. Also, if there aren't any filters in the background, understanding what might be going on in the background, maybe asking someone if they're okay or if they have a break, if they need a break. So some of those similar things. Another one is connections to support. So even if someone might be virtual, what Devontae had shared about still finding ways, if they're interested in having some connections or making those, that we would help to facilitate those no matter whether they're virtual or in person. Anything else you all want to add about the virtual space?
Yes. So recently I took some facilitation trainings around specifically engaging youth and young people in creative ways. And some of that did talk about doing that in the virtual space. So I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the comfortability piece, but some of the things you can do, which you've talked about, using platforms that young people are already familiar with. You can still also engage in those rapport building icebreakers, and they can be interactive. We have used Mentimeter before in the past. I've used Kahoot before, which is another one that a lot of educators use. And so there are software that you can allow people to do polls in real time if it's a focus group or an interview. There's also ways that you can do visual engagement. You might have someone, drop a meme or an emoji relating to how they're feeling. Those are some of the ways in which you can start to break it up. I would also say that a lot of times we think that we have to throw everything that we know about facilitation or everything that we know about research and evaluation and data collection when we do virtual, but we don't necessarily have to do that. So you could even still make use of the physical space. Ask the person, it might be an event, it might be an interaction where you ask the person, like, let's stand up, let's sit down, like, let's stand to the left or to the right if you have this preference. And so just in the same ways that you could potentially work with an audience in a physical space, you can do some of that in a virtual space as well. And then I would say the most important thing for virtual spaces when you're thinking about ways to engage youth is about how to engage people with different language and readability. And so one of the things that I also recommend is a fun icebreaker is a gesture game where you actually don't use any sound at all. And so it doesn't matter what the language proficiency or the readability of your participants are. You can do one where, for instance, I might pour some tea into a cup and I sip my cup and then I pass it over to Dante and he would take the cup, sip it, and then he might crumple that into a ball and create a baseball bat that he hits over to Brandy, and everyone kind of plays around. And that's one of the ways in which you can start to engage youth in some virtual ways that are allow for it to kind of remain feeling more casual and a little less like a telehealth appointment.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, Brandy, I was actually going to throw it to you. I was going to say, Brandy, if you want to talk about this, because I see multiple questions about kind of the finance piece of how did we come up with the dollar amount and what that piece looks like.
Yep, I was just going to raise those next about compensation and safety protocols is where I was thinking we go next. So compensation, we at Community Science have done a lot of research around compensation, in particular this team around youth. I personally will say I can't find any good stuff, just like the chat is saying about like what are standards. What I've leaned toward using in these past few years is $20 per hour. And for the things we do, we try to think about like what is the commitment realistically. So for instance, with our community advisory group with young people, we pay $20 per hour and it's about a 5-hour monthly commitment. So we pay, that all, at one time. Plus we have some additional funding for like discretionary transportation, that kind of thing. For these interviews, we've done $50 gift cards. So because they are mostly in person, so I think of that as kind of like it's about a 2-hour commitment, depending on how long the interview goes, plus some time to get there and back. And then I'm kind of rounding up because I feel a little weird about giving someone $40, just me personally. And my personal status is also to like round up. If you think you're a little bit off, round up, because you're asking people to share their trauma, to do things that are inconvenient, to maybe go to a place they prefer not to go. So I like to use like the roundup when you can, and especially when the budget can hold it.
I also want to mention, because there was a question about, is it the same? Is it a standard rate, flat rate across? No matter if they finish the interview or not, they do receive the $50 gift card, no matter how long their interview did go.
Yeah, and we also usually do, if it's a smaller amount, we've done cash in the past. These $50, I feel like is a little bit high, especially in these situations, to give someone cash. So we're doing gift cards. And the other thing that we've done in some other studies is investing in a local place, but it has to be like a good place that people would actually want to go to. And to me, if that's not clear, then cash is king.
For virtual, we've done Tango, which is a
Yeah.
service that actually allows participants to choose which gift card they would like. So they get $50 in the bank. They might choose a $25 Starbucks and $25 Amazon gift card, and they're able to do that. And so another way in which we offer flexibility in payment and allowing young people to have preference is by using Tango.
Okay, and there are some questions, Danielle, about the training that you shared about youth-focused facilitation. There's 2 questions about that. If you want to drop in the chat, we do see that as a resource. We've had some other colleagues go through it, and right now what we're working on as a team is Danielle's gone through it, helping us get some training. Dante will, and the plan is that eventually our whole team will have that training either through Train the Trainer or have gone through ourselves. And we want this team to have the youth-focused facilitation as well as trauma-informed research training. We all have that kind of like background, but not formal training. So we've also been, if other people have resources too, looking for places where we might all get that same formal training as a team to build on processes we've been using ourselves. Devontae, do you want to talk about safety protocols?
Yes, I think, and Danielle's going to touch on some of it in the 3C. So I think after we do that piece, it may be worthwhile to do it.
Okay.
So I'm just dropping quickly in the chat. The organization is called Partners for Youth Empowerment. And they have lots of training.
And then I was just, oh, I'm sorry, Danielle. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I was like, I just put the link in the chat now, just so you know, there for you.
I was just going to say one that's not covered in this last one is about how do we use quotes for our work. We use them both just in qualitative methods to share our findings as well as for advocacy. In general, our reporting is usually to inform practice, policy, advocacy, all of those different pieces.
So typically when we're doing analysis, we're doing the coding, reviewing interviews. To Dante's point, if you're in an interview and something really stands out to you, you might jot down a timestamp if you're recording, or jot down what the quote is. And then when you're reviewing your transcripts or you're recording to do your themes, your analysis, whatever that might look like for you, that's another opportunity. We always use a second quote or a second code that's specific to just great quotes or a quotation bank. And anytime you're reading and you're coming across things in your data that you feel like could potentially be great quotes, we just throw it in there. And then as you are maybe writing for a report or you're looking to pull something for advocacy, you kind of already have a repository of a lot of really good, impactful quotes that might be able to use. I would also add that with quotes, sometimes people often fall into the trap of wanting to quote everything because they really want to use the language of the participants. But sometimes when that happens, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And so if you use quotes more sparingly, then they really have a bigger punch when you do use them. They can have a deeper impact. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to wrap up quickly talking about the 3 C's. So the first C is about confidentiality. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. Of course, maintaining a private space, we all know part of human subjects research is the application for the IRB. I do think that it's important to note that while we talked about all of these different components, at every single step, this was a very critical decision point for our team. So we thought through, for instance, even with being able to have virtual interviews and what that meant. So initially, we wanted to have virtual interviews for minors as well as adults. And IRB basically told us, like, there's not really a way for us to guarantee that a minor can be in a safe and confidential space and do they have to have a parent present during the interview, right? There's lots of logistics that could potentially come into play. Other things related to confidentiality, sometimes you might see recommendations where people might want to bring in a peer or a trusted friend that can potentially provide support, but also can potentially have confidentiality breaches. And so it's important to kind of think through your project for your team, some of the risks that you might want to take on or not. I would also add that when we're thinking about confidentiality, it's also about what the participants share beyond this. And so for some studies, for ours in particular, we were looking at people who might have interactions with the criminal justice system. And so a certificate of confidentiality is something that you can apply for with a government agency, and it adds an additional layer of protection that prevents participants from self-incriminating. And so the record, the court cannot subpoena your research records if someone might, be talking about their experience selling drugs that can't then later be used against them in a criminal trial. And so those are some of the ways that you can actually allow the participants to feel like the things that they're sharing are truly confident. Thinking about ways in which to make the space more comfortable, of course, doing active listening and engaging, thinking about ways in which you can make the space more comfortable, being mindful of your body language. I've talked a little bit about ways you can make this space, more comfortable for youth who you're engaging in a virtual setting, being flexible with day, time, of course. Some other examples are like letting participants choose the gender of their interviewer, their interviewee. Also thinking through the safety piece, right? It's also about comfortability for your team. And so we've already talked about, we do go out in pairs. We also have, when we go out, we are fortunate enough to have iPhones. And so we can share each other's location if we need to, in case something's going on. We also have had to do interviews where we might be offsite. And in those cases, we bring a staff person with us that might be from the organization. We had one young person who, for example, wasn't able to come into the building. And so we did the interview outside, but there was still someone from the organization there. And so always kind of thinking about those dynamics. And then with consent, of course, you always have informed and youth assent, but it's also an important component of the consent process is to do a teach back or a repeat method, where you actually have participants explain in their own words what the informed consent is, rather than, just having them quickly sign and then you jump in. So in the last couple of, 2-ish minutes or so, I'm gonna reopen the floor.
I will add a little bit more about the safety, because I did see the question in chat. Some of those other safety protocols that we have in place is, Dante talked about this a little bit earlier, is we're meeting with those organizations and nonprofits that we are doing our interviews with beforehand, weeks beforehand, to kind of go over safety protocols for them. We're asking them about the kind of context of the neighborhood. Are there certain groups or youth from certain areas of the community that it may not be safe for them to be in this neighborhood? Kind of what does those dynamics look like? We also touch base with them 24 to 48 hours before we're doing our interviews on site to kind of see what has been the ongoing context and kind of environment in the community. Has things changed since we previously had those conversations? We're making sure that we have access to a private room so that the interviewer and the youth is in a secluded space, so that other people can't hear the conversation. They can't see who's in there talking to the interviewer at that time. We think through the process of making sure that if there is that potential that folks from different sides of the city, it may not be safe for them to be together at the same time. We're making sure that's when that scheduling times come in so that they're not overlapping. It's not the possibility that this person may be leaving and this person may be arriving. So making sure we're trying to avoid all of those. So really thinking through a lot of these complexities. And sometimes there may be things that we wasn't able to think about, but being partnered with those organizations, they can help us and give us that local context that you may not know firsthand. And so it was really great to be able to lean in on our local nonprofits and organizations to also understand the local environment in terms of like this national and larger environment.
All right, that's our time. Anything else from the team? No, all good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I just want to add, I guess, quickly that this work, we always talk about right now, lived experience has become a buzzword that everyone wants to include. And so these are some of the ways that you can start to think about intentionally incorporating lived experience, because it's not just enough to bring people in. We also want to do it in ways that are supportive and helpful to them so that we don't do more harm to the very organizations, populations, and communities we're trying to help.
For sure. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining and sticking around. We answered all of our questions live or through the chat, but if you still want to contact us, feel free to reach out through this webinar channel. It has all of our information on our website. We're glad to chat more, and have a wonderful day. Take care.